Throughout the conflict in East Ukraine between Russian-backed militants and Ukrainian forces, NATO has been one of the most vocal critics of Russia's aggression in the Donbas, even after the signing of a peace deal last month brokered by France and Germany and the announcement of a ceasefire. The military alliance continues to warn of a build-up in eastern Ukraine of Russian forces. Just last week, NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe, General Philip Breedlove, declared that Russian President Vladimir Putin had once again, quote, upped the ante and said that the situation in the Donbas was getting worse every day. To find out more about those and other comments made by the military alliance, Oleksiy Bobrovnikov from Ukrainian broadcaster TSN spoke with General Breedlove in an exclusive interview.
A year ago, you've mentioned 4,000 Russian troops, 40,000 Russian troops being able to go into Ukraine. And this February, you've mentioned the 80,000 of them. What numbers can we talk about now?
There was a period before. Remember, in the second half of August, when the Russian forces came across in three distinct axes of attack, there was a large number of battalion task groups on the east side of the Ukrainian border before they came across. What we have seen since then is smaller numbers of battalion task groups on the east side of the border. Today, about half of that force on the eastern border, and an increased number of Russian forces inside of Ukraine. I don't like to use numbers, because the minute you use a number, it's going to be exactly wrong. And our intelligence is not perfect. Remember that the Russian forces and the Russian-backed forces have maintained this portion of the border in the southeastern part of Ukraine is wide open. Forces move back and forth at will across this border. Supplies, ammunition, men, money, all move back and forth quickly across this border to supply and enable those Russian troops that are inside of Ukraine and those Russian-backed troops that are inside of Ukraine.
Having increased or decreased these days after this Minsk agreements, call it that way?
The answer is yes. We've seen both. We've seen the number of battalion task groups go up, and now we've seen it go down a little bit.
But just a little bit?
Yes. So the numbers are constantly changing. And this is, I think, a part of exactly what Russia wants to have happen, and that is it is hard for us to keep up with which ones are going, which ones are in, which ones are out, and how they're positioning.
Well, this is no talk of real withdrawal, right, sir?
So right now we can't confirm withdrawal. We do see heavy artillery being moved on both sides of the line of contact. But we do not know what's happening to the artillery on the east side of the line of contact, because the OSCE observers have not been allowed to go and observe that they're breaking down, that they're moving, and where they're moving to. So we see them moving, but some of them moving, but we don't know if they're returning or just simply repositioning for the next engagement.
There's a lot of talk about these red lines, and in Ukraine we're pretty sick and tired of this red line talk. But we're talking to politicians, and finally I'm talking to a sucker. And this red line, where is the place, geographically speaking, where NATO troops, allied troops, US troops may intervene?
Well, you're talking to a sacker, but you are talking to the wrong person, because this is going to be a uniquely political decision, not a military decision. What we do know now is that NATO has said over and over, and I believe today it is firmly the same stance, that the decision of what happens in eastern Ukraine has to be a diplomatic and a political one. It would be incredibly harsh to drive a military solution in the east. So we need to come to that place and time where the sides, Russia and Ukraine, can sit down and determine what is going to be that diplomatic and political solution in the east. Between now and then, the nations of the West, bigger than NATO, but certainly NATO nations, are all making their own internal decisions about how they will aid Ukraine to get to that point where we can reach this diplomatic and political solution.
You've been to Washington for a couple of weeks. You traveled there, I think you've met the new defense secretary. Of course, you've met him, and you talked a lot. But what piece of news have you brought from there?
So I think you've seen it playing out in the press already, and that is that many Western nations, and certainly the United States now, speaking as a United States officer, the commander of U.S. EUCOM, our nation is going through the same decisions that others are. Do we provide lethal aid? Do we provide non-lethal aid? How do we move forward in this relationship with Ukraine? And I think the news that you see playing out is that many senior leaders in America are saying the same thing, that we should consider the use of all of our instruments of national power. Certainly, Mr. Putin is using all of his. We like to talk about it's an American word, the DIME model, D-I-M-E, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Mr. Putin is bringing intense diplomatic pressure, trying to discredit the government in Kyiv. Mr. Putin has an incredible information campaign, or some would call it a disinformation campaign. Mr. Putin clearly has put his military instrument in the field in Ukraine in direct support of this operation. And Mr. Putin is using all of the economic tools, gas prices, gas deliveries, recalling loans early, et cetera, et cetera. So Mr. Putin is using every one of the instruments of national power. And I think what you see now is that the West is beginning to look at this in the same way. We should not necessarily preclude the use of any of our instruments of power.
Where do you think he's heading, actually?
Yeah. So I would not offer my personal opinion. I would offer the opinion of many who we discuss this with. And that is, it's less about the land, it's more about affecting the future of Ukraine. We say occasionally that the goal of Mr. Putin might be, along the following lines: keep the West out of Ukraine and keep Ukraine out of the West. So I think it may be less about how much land is required. It's more about how does he affect the political leanings of the government in Kyiv.
So do you think he moved forward in this direction, getting more ground for that?
So I would say that I would leave that decision to politicians. I think that Minsk of last year, September, gives us a framework for a way ahead, which reestablishes the territorial integrity of Ukraine and reestablishes the international border. The 12 February agreement, which is what I think you are referring to, it is a tough discussion of lines and what those lines mean. And so at this point, I think I would leave the interpretation of how those lines affect Ukraine to the politicians.
You know far better than me how many, say, Russian agents had infiltrated Ukraine by now. And this is an issue, and this is a trouble, and, you know, we're getting more and more terrorist activities. We're getting, from the start, we're getting much of the intelligence being, you know, passed to the enemy. Somehow, can you assist Ukraine in terms of, you know, intelligence, surveillance, and, you know, helping to deal with the issue, to fight with this trouble?
So both in a NATO hat and in a U.S. hat, we have efforts to help Ukraine understand its intelligence requirements and capabilities. You sort of talked to two different issues, though. Intelligence as it relates to all things Ukraine, and then you talked about this sort of internal infiltration of Russian individuals. This, I think, is much more an internal issue for Ukraine. To the degree that we're able to help them understand the problem, I think that is something that we can discuss. But right now, that is something that I think you know more you know better about yourself than we know about you.
What do you think about the initiative of letting peacekeepers to control the situation?
So I have heard these discussions. I think that, again, these are political decisions that are to be made. I think the most important thing to do is if we end up with a peacekeeping mission on the ground, that peacekeeping mission should not contain the military forces of any of the belligerents in the conflict.
Do you think it may happen this year?
I would not want to speculate. Again, this is a very political decision and a very political way forward.
You talked about Baltic states and the danger from Russia. Clearly, these are NATO allies here. But when we talk about the CIS region, where do you think is the most probable place where Putin may hit next?
It's really hard to determine what's in Mr. Putin's head. I think that, as you have heard and you have seen, that there are clear indications that they will reach out to those places where there are Russian-speaking populations. So these would be of concern. I think we see already in a few places that there are increased tensions in Transnistria, Moldova, other places like that. All of these, I think, are places where we should have our eyes wide open as to the possibilities.